Hello everyone. In this video I'm gonna show you how to do random sound sequences with Unreal Engine 5's Metasounds. The example I'm using here is a sequence of bird sounds, but you can do whatever you have in mind for that. It's something you could apply in generating ambiences for your game as like one puzzle piece of it. So for instance, you would generate this bird sequence, then have like one or two loops in there, like in a bigger Metasound where you would access all these little patches, and then maybe also have another sequence for a different kind of animal, whatever you have in mind. It's really nice to have these kind of generative elements in your ambience, because then it will always sound a little bit different and a little bit unpredictable. And that's what we want from something that mimics nature. Let's first have a listen. The general structure looks like this. Like, we'll go into this in a bit more detail in a second, but just to give a quick overview, we have a Waveplayer that picks a random sound wave out of this array here. Then this is being repeated a couple of times in a random range. Then we stop the thing and we have a little break in a random range. And then we trigger the whole thing again. Then this thing loops on and on forever until we stop it here or in blueprint code. I'm also going to show you some other iterations of how I approach this sequence later in the video, but let's first go through it step by step. So we begin by having input, and then we have this trigger any node. This is basically just a way to loop things. The simplest way to loop anything in Metasounds is to just activate this little loop toggle here in the Waveplayer. But the problem is that it would just forever loop whatever the random get node randomly picked here out of this array. But with the trigger any node, we have a bit more control over the specific point in time where something should be repeated. So like return to the start again. So the way these trigger any nodes work is we have inputs here that we can access by defining a variable at some point of time, like for instance here or here. And then I can just promote to graph variable and give this a name. I'm just going to leave this with the default name output. And this variable will then define the specific point of time in the sequence where we want to return back to the start. And by using this variable that we just defined, just typing the name in, we will say when this variable is being accessed, we want to return to the start and play back again everything that happens after this trigger any node. Next thing is just some randomization. We have a random float node for the values of the pitch shifting. So here like a range of -4 to 7, but I can put in whatever I want. And the same for the volume, which I can access here in the stereo mixer at the end. Next thing is the Soundwave selection, super basic, something you do in almost any kind of Metasound. We have the Waveplayer, in this case it's stereo, and we have like an array here of the bird sounds. So this is like all the bird sounds that can be randomly picked, and the value of this array is then connected to the Waveplayer. The Waveplayer also always has like these audio outputs, so purple is always audio and this shade of green is always float, and we connect this here with the stereo mixer. We didn't necessarily need a stereo mixer here or like any kind of mixer here, but I wanted to have that to be able to access the gain here. And then I forward this to a reverb, which is something that is kind of new. In the early versions of Metasounds, we didn't have reverb yet. And now we have, which is really cool. Normally, I wouldn't do that. I would just set up a reverb for the specific environment in the game we're in and don't set up anything inside Metasound specifically, because we want a reverb to be affected for all the diegetic sounds inside the game space. But right now I don't have a game project where I could show this Metasound. So this is just nice for preview purposes. Next thing is the random time between repeats. So Here I define a random range of 0 to 0.05 seconds, so relatively short because that's just what sounded the best to me with bird sounds. But yeah, it's nice for other types of sequences to play around with these values a little bit. Next thing is the random number of repeats. So the trigger counter for me in this whole patch is a way to say how long the sequence should be. So in this case, I defined it to be as long as 2 to 10 repetitions of that sound wave here. But what it technically does is it literally counts how often a signal is sent into the direction of the trigger counter. With these values being set up, the trigger counter knows when it should, well, reset. And then we can send out something in this output here. Again, I'm using a variable here, and this variable I can use in the trigger control node below. The trigger control node is basically a gate. By default, I set it up to be open, so to pass through any sound. And by using this stop variable here at the close input, we tell the trigger control node to close the gates. And that's nice because we want the sequence to have a little pause. This pause and its length is defined with a trigger delay node, and by using a random time node to define the time range of how long this delay or, well, this pause should be. So in our case, it's 1 to 3 seconds long. And then we want to restart the whole sequence. But in order to pass audio through it again, we also need to open the gate again. For that, we set the restart here after the trigger delay and use it as an input here in the trigger control node. So basically, when these nodes have done their job, we send out the restart variable and then open the gate again. And then we send out the repeat variable and restart the whole sequence. So as I said before, I want to show you how I approach this whole thing in prior iterations and the flaws were and what I improved. So in this very first version, it's a much more simple setup, actually using a trigger repeat node. And again, like a trigger counter and all that. And then at some point we have the Waveplayer and random picking of a sound wave in the array. And then here all things starts again. It's fine, but it has two problems. One problem is that the time between sounds in a sequence will always be the same, because that's just a thing with the trigger repeat. You have like a fixed period. So like when this sequence is started, it will pick a random value in this range I've set, and then it will always have this specific value until the whole sequence has been completed. So for instance, it's always 0.2 seconds for each gap in between the sounds, and that makes it sound rather unnatural. Another problem with this whole setup is that there will always be overlap of sounds. Since this whole setup is before this Waveplayer and we don't trigger anything on finished, there will always be overlap of sounds because the meta sound doesn't wait until the prior sound wave has been finished, and that can create lots of little pop noises and makes it sound a bit unpleasant. And here's another version of how I approached this. So one thing I was able to fix here is there's not always the same time in between sounds within a sequence. I did that by adding this second trigger repeat and random time node here and linking that with the period. That's something I found online in some Unreal forum, and it's definitely nice, but we still have the issue of overlapping sounds here. The key is really to have all this logic of stopping and restarting happening after on finished. It's a bit more fiddly, it's a bit more of a complex setup, but it gets the job done, and that's the most important thing. So yeah, that's it. If you have any questions about the setup, if anything of how I did this is unclear, or if I didn't explain something properly, let me know in the comments.